The next civilization is the Maya, one of the greatest empires we've ever seen. And the Maya were known for having an immense city state complex or structure, very similar to what you'd see with like the Greeks, for instance. So they were highly organized, right, and used their city states, right, to create a web of interconnectivity, right, that they would use for trade, they'd use for consultation. So again, there was a highly organized civilization. We're only going to talk about a couple city states for obvious reasons. So I'll highlight the most important ones, but again, it's important to consider this web of interconnectivity that really facilitated, right, all things for the Maya. This was a literate society. This is a society who had writing, right, was able to document itself. Unfortunately for us, when the Spanish arrive, they undertake a project of basically purging, right, all the Mayan documents, even going so far as to burn them, right, to destroy them. And so at the end of all this, there are what is said to be five Mayan texts that remain. So try to imagine your entire culture, right, being decimated down to five texts, right, that are left, five pieces of writing that are left. But this is what happens to the Maya. But before this, of course, they had an immensely literate society. With the monuments, of course, the glyphs on the monuments remain. So we're able to look at the glyphs, right, to get a sense of the Mayan history and translate from that point, right, to understand what the Mayans were saying about themselves, because we do have written examples that we can use as a key or a point of reference, right, to try to understand the language of the glyphs, right, that they left behind. So we'll look at their monuments and talk about how you can use the monuments to sort of decode, right, who were these leaders, when were they ruling, right, some important information there. Yeah, as I said before many times, right, this culture is going to have a lot of monuments to rulers, so we'll be looking at a lot of things related to rulership. And one of the things the Mayans are known for, of course, is their advanced calendrics or their calendar making skills, right? Which leads a lot of people to talk about, the idea of the end of the world, right, related to the Mayans. The Mayans use what we call world ages. So they're very similar to Indian culture in that way. Where if you think about how the Indians thought about time was kind of like these time bubbles, right? That there would be that would come into being and then be destroyed, right? Over and over and over again. In these cycles essentially. So the Mayans to me think very similarly to that, where they think about how time sort of happens in an age, right? Or a cycle. And they counted their time as beginning around 3114 BC, and then they thought their world would end in 2012 AD. Now, what this means by end is debatable, right? Some people have said that they didn't mean the world would end. They meant the world would enter into a new phase, right, of existence, or a new phase of being, essentially. So, what end means, of course, is very debatable. Um, but again, if you look at their calendar and try to match it up with dates from the European world, it's exactly a spot on. So they were lining up their time in a way that was very efficient. And again, if you try to lay the Julio Claudian calendar over it, which is the calendar we use, right, Europeans use, Westerners use, then you would be able to match up significant dates right on down the line. Their calendars work together. So you'll notice that they sort of fit together like wheels. Of course, I have a nice, image of that, of how the calendars sort of fit together as wheels. They're sort of rolling along together. So it's a very sort of interesting image, again, about cycles, right, or continuation. And here are some diagrams looking at the world ages and how we describe them. And notice that we use the image of a pyramid, which was what the Mayans built, to sort of speak about these different world ages and how they related to the actual context of time. And again, notice that the idea of the end of all cycles, right, was, this idea of 2012, right? This is a nice comic kind of playing with that. I started teaching at TCC in 2003, and it used to be a fun joke before 2012 to be like, in this many years till the world ends, right? Um, and then of course we went past 2012, and I don't get to tell the joke anymore. But again, the Mayans, what were they getting at with 2012? We're not exactly sure if they meant the world ending, or again, this idea of a shift in perception. Some people suggested they were thinking about maybe the poles would shift, polarity would shift. Again, it's one of the things that makes the Mayans so mysterious, as far as not really understanding what they meant by all this. But again, you'll notice that they're very advanced as far as how they're thinking about time and how they're codifying it. Now, as we look at the art pieces, of course, we'll be looking at a couple main points about the pieces. I'm going to set up our discussion based around cities. So we're going to talk about a city and then talk about objects within the city. It seems the easiest way to kind of go about this. And of course, we'll look at things like blood, which I've already mentioned. And then we'll look at fertility and how it relates to this art, and also the role of the gods in the different pieces that we'll see. We're going to start out looking at the early cities, as I call them, right? Copan, Tikal, and Bonaparte. So this will be the first sort of part of our Mayan discussion. And these are the earlier Mayan cities. We'll then conclude by looking at what I call the later Mayan cities, which are Uxmal and Chichen Itza. So they'll be towards the end of the Mayan time frame. So these are the 5 cities that I'm going to use to frame our discussion of the Maya. Again, I mentioned they have over 50 cities, so we're looking at a very small fragment of that, but these are the ones that have the best examples of art and culture, right, that give us a sense of who these people really were. Again, we're going to start with Copan, Tikal, and Bonaparte. And so on the map, right, if you're looking at the map, you'll notice that we're in truly Mesoamerica. We're looking at Copan here first, which is on the border between Guatemala and Honduras, right? We'll move up then to Tikal, right here, and then later go over to Bonaparte, which you see here. So we'll be in this truly Mesoamerican region right there in the middle as we talk about these cities. I was lucky enough in 2006 to go on a trip with one of my favorite tour groups, Overseas Adventure Travel, OAT. And I did what was called the Route of the Maya. So I went with my mom and we went and did Copan, Tikal, right? So we went around and saw a lot of these cities. When I was younger, 19, when I was still in college, I actually did Chichen Itza and Uxmal. So you'll see some pictures from when I was younger, right, when I saw the later Mayan cities, and then when I'm older, right, and I saw the earlier ones. So I kind of did this in reverse, funny enough. But again, I was lucky enough to go to these places and see them myself and document them, right, where my mother and I went. Copan, the name, refers to the idea of the place in the clouds or the bridge. So what does this name mean? Copan was actually located at a sort of higher elevation than a lot of Mayan cities. And so it's logically called the place in the clouds because often it would be in the clouds, right? You'd have these cloud forests that would roll through. And again, most Mayan cities are at a lower elevation. It also was called the bridge because it was south, more southern, right within the Mayan Empire. And so it was a city that did a lot of trade with South American cultures, right? So it literally was thought of as a bridge between the Mayan or Mesoamerican area, right, and the South American cultures that were existing to the south at this time. Because you can remember, no cultures exist in a vacuum, right? They're all trading with each other and talking to each other. So this is where the derivation of those two come from. The city of Copan is located in a rainforest, and again at a slightly higher elevation. And so it is a city that, if it's not maintained, is going to be encroached on by the rainforest quite quickly. So when I was there, you could note where the city was really just eaten up by the rainforest right after its abandonment, and where when archaeologists came in here, they had to do a lot of reconstruction to get it back to looking what it really looked like. But they did, right? They created enough to make a sense of what this city looked like. As you go into Copan, they have this city plan in sort of the courtyard that you could look at that shows you what the city would have looked like. And to me, when I was looking at this, it stressed to me that the unity of the empire is really about order and control. In most rulerships, this is how they have to exist. You have to have unity of the people behind you, and you have to have control. If you don't have those two things, then you're not a very good leader. And so the plan reflects that. It reflects this unifiedness, this orderliness. And you'll notice that the monuments are sort of laid out around central courtyards and then different monuments. Um, so there's a sense of creating distinctive monuments for people to focus on, but then having open space that they could use. And that seems to be replicated over and over again. Notice that the elevation of the monuments is a lot lower than you'll see at other Mayan cities. I'll compare this to Tikal later on. But you'll notice that they're a little bit lower in elevation. They're not as tall because again, this was already a very elevated place as far as its location. So what we think is that they didn't feel they had to build mountains here. They didn't have to build tall monuments, right? Because they're already up high. So it's an interesting thing. Again, especially when you look at some place like Tikal that has very, very big pyramids, very, very tall pyramids, right? Again, I just took some shots walking around in Copan to give you a sense of the space. So you'll notice here, again, lots of monuments surrounding courtyards. So I think that probably, people would sit up on the staircases here and then activities would take place in the courtyard. And this is how, you use a centralized space of this kind, is having, again, a place for people to look out onto these courtyards. Throughout the courtyards, you'll see a lot of standing monuments, what we call stelae, if you remember, these standing vertical monuments. So you see a lot of these. The Mayans will also call them tree stones, and we'll talk about that term as well. And they tell usually the stories of their leaders, right? So they function like to me like billboards, saying like, "Hey, don't you remember this leader? Hey, what about that leader?" Right? One of the most famous ones is Altar Q, and one of the things you'll notice when archaeologists came and started working at a lot of these sites, they didn't really know what to call these monuments. So they actually just started to number them or use letters. They felt like it was an objective system rather than giving them a specific name. They just, as they found the monuments, would literally just go through the alphabet using that to label them. So that's why you see things like altar number 4 or altar Q, is because it was just thought to be an objective way of labeling the objects as the archaeologists move through the site. So this is altar Q, and it records the dynasty of rulers, right, who have been here at Copan. So what you'll note is that you have the founding ruler, right, who is pictured on the left, handing off the power to the 16th ruler. And then the other 14 rulers are also on the monument. So they're depicted in chronological order on the monument. So we think monuments like this are meant to suggest, how do you look at power? How do you understand power? And a lot of power is having your power legitimized, right? Having other people say, yes, that person is in power, right? So in this monument, the 16th ruler is being told by the first ruler, yes, you are powerful. Yes, you have the ability to rule. So it's a legitimization, right, of rulership. And again, that's very significant for being an accepted ruler, is to have people say, yes, you're legitimate. Yes, you're acceptable. Yes, we believe in you, right? You'll see images of zoomorphic gods sort of strewn around the location as well. You'll see the sort of dancing jaguar right over on the right, sort of this snake like god over on the left. Notice the paint on a lot of these. A lot of people, forget the fact that these were heavily painted monuments that we now see in a ruined state. So consider that as well. One of the most famous monuments at Copan is the tree stone, right, to 18 Rabbit. Now, I mentioned that the formal name, the vocabulary term is stele. We've talked about this before with the Raimonde stele, but Mayans actually called them tree stones. So if you want to use their actual vocabulary, they called these tree stones, right? They were tree stones. And they were used to, again, commemorate very popular or significant leaders, right? 18 Rabbit was one of these men. And the names, right, these are us trying to kind of translate, right, the idea of how they were naming themselves, right, to English, right? So we use a lot of numbers and then animals, right? You'll see that very often to try to kind of get at the essence of like, what were these people trying to call themselves? How do you translate it, right, from the glyphs? So he's 18 Rabbit, right? You'll notice that he's wearing regalia, so he's wearing kind of this headdress on his head, and we relate it to the idea of the maize god, which was related to creation. Maize was a staple crop in this region. It's similar to corn. And so to be in control of your people was to be in control of their food. So you often see this relationship to the maize god, the idea that you can feed your people or give them what they need to live. 18 Rabbit was a very long-lived ruler. He ruled for 67 years until he was actually sacrificed for Copan. Now, this is an interesting thing to consider regarding blood here in Mayan culture. Blood was not used except as a very specific symbolic offering. In the case of 18 Rabbit, there had been fighting going on between two different city states. And basically, he was trying to control this outside city state, which was related more to Toltecs, which is a different kind of group. It came down to it where the other city state would give them peace if 18 Rabbit would sacrifice himself. And so he was actually beheaded for the good of his people. So it was said that his blood was an offering, right, of peace, right? And after that, the other city state did leave them in peace. So it was this idea of, as a leader, sometimes you're called upon to do something greater for your people, that will protect them, which is very significant as a story. This monument is made out of andesite, which is an interesting stone. It actually is sort of wet when you pull it out of the ground and porous, and it starts to dry upon contact to the air. So you have to carve it very fast before it sort of solidifies, almost like becomes concrete. And so again, just a note on an interesting material that you don't see used very often in carving, for obvious reasons, right? Because you got to work fast when you use it. Here's a nice close up of 18 Rabbit, right, as well. Notice the paint, right, still kind of left on the monument. And I wanted to note that his name really wasn't 18 Rabbit if you think about their dialect. His name would have been more like 18 Agouti, because this is the animal that the Spanish saw when they showed up, and they didn't really understand that, like what to call it. So they called it a rabbit, but it's actually an agouti. It's a different kind of animal entirely. So if we want to joke about, like, was he 18 rabbit? He probably was more like 18 agouti, because there's no rabbits in this region, but there's agouti. So again, just the collision of European and indigenous culture and what usually happens from that, and how funny it can be. And again, there's lots of tree stones around the site. You'll notice often many of them have little shelters over them just to protect them from acid rain or any kind of environmental destruction. And a lot of these monuments that are still out on the grounds are actually reproductions, with the real monument having been taken inside a museum because of, again, the climate and what the climate can do to a lot of these external monuments. It's a big problem with archaeology, is acid rain and the damage it can do to monuments. And again, you'll notice that these monuments have pictographs all over them, the glyphs that they wrote with. And that's what we use to translate the stories and translate, what is the monument trying to tell us. Here's another tree stone erected by the leader Smoke Shell. And I always love showing you Smoke Shell's famous monument at Copan, which is the hieroglyphic staircase. It's one of my favorite monuments anywhere in the world. I just find it really, really fascinating. There's a big tarp over it because it's constantly been worked on by archaeologists, and of course, they're trying to protect the monument as well. Now, what was it? This was dedicated by Smoke Shell, right? And basically, you have this giant staircase that was meant to chronologically depict or document all the leaders of Copan. And so you'll notice you have the archaeologists right up on the stairs, and they're photographing the different stair steps, right? This monument actually was meant to read like a chronological list, right, all the way up the monument of all the leaders who had ruled, right, at Copan. It's supposed to go up, 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 and basically would have ended with Smoke Shell because he was the last leader at that point. Um, this is an interesting story about how to not do your archaeology badly. So when archaeologists first found the site, early 1900s, they were all archaeologists at that time were about reconstruction. They were about putting things back together as quickly as possible so you could see what it looked like. So when the archaeologists reconstructed the staircase, they just started putting stones in wherever because they didn't understand how to read the glyphs yet. Today, we now know that the glyphs are all mixed up, and so the staircase is all scrambled. However, it's very bad archaeology to go and take it apart again and reconstruct it again. It would be very damaging to the site. So, what archaeologists are trying to do today, and this is what you see the archaeologists doing, is they're trying to take pictures of each of the steps and then decode what the glyphs are saying and then trying to unscramble it virtually to understand the actual real order because it's out of order. So again, to me, it's just a hilarious story about how early archaeology was often done very slapdash on the ground, was not scientific in the way that we think about archaeology today, where archaeologists today half the time don't even reconstruct things because they think that's way more damaging than just trying to make a computer model or something of that type out of it. So different times, different technology, right? But I love this monument. I think it's a lot of fun. And I'd mentioned before that, of course, you can look at the role of blood, right? And see different things related to bloodshed in the Mayan culture. But what we find with the Mayan, of course, is that they use their blood very strategically, and we'll continue to talk about that. And I always want you to be thinking about how we see these monuments today when we visit these sites is not how they looked. Just like the Greeks, the Mayans would have colorfully painted their temples. The Greeks did this, the Mayans do it as well, because why would you want a boring, bland temple, right? So they would paint these things with these vibrant, beautiful colors. And then, over the course of time, of course, the color bleeds off, the paint leaches away, and we're left with these bone white, kind of structures. So just like with the Greeks, you're not really seeing these monuments as they should be. And so at Copan, they actually have in the museum a reconstruction of one of the temples where you can see what they would have looked like in their colored states. And it's really, really cool.